On the morning of the 7th of December, 1941, a young black sailor was collecting laundry in the belly of a battleship. He was a cook. The Navy did not allow men like him to fight. He had never been trained to fire a weapon, and by the rules of the time, he was not even permitted to touch one. 2 hours later, that same cook was standing on a burning deck, firing an anti-aircraft gun at enemy planes, having already carried his dying captain to safety. His name was Doris Miller, and what he did that morning was so undeniable that even a Navy built to ignore him could not look away. He was born in Waco, Texas, in the autumn of 1919, the son of farmers working the land in a part of the country where the rules of segregation governed every hour of a black family's life. Most people who knew him called him Dory. He grew up strong and quiet, big for his age, the kind of boy who hunted to put food on the table and worked the fields alongside his father and his brothers. These were hard years for the family. They worked land that mostly belonged to someone else, in a system that kept black farmers poor by design. When the Great Depression came down on the country, it fell hardest on families like theirs. Young Dory had to leave school to help keep the household alive. He took on the cooking, he took on heavy labor, and he carried responsibilities that would have broken most grown men, all before he was out of his teens. He learned early that the world was not built to give him anything, and that whatever he wanted, he would have to earn twice over. By the time he was 19, he wanted two things. He wanted to see something of the world beyond those Texas fields, and he wanted to send money home to his family. The Navy offered both, a steady paycheck and a way out. So in the autumn of 1939, Doris Miller walked into a recruiting office and enlisted in the United States Navy. So Doris Miller had made his choice. He would serve his country, but his country had already made a choice of its own, long before he ever walked through that door, and it had decided exactly how small his role was going to be. But the Navy he joined had already decided exactly how far a man like him would be allowed to go. This was a segregated force in a segregated country. For a black sailor in 1939, there was essentially one job available, no matter how strong, how smart, or how brave he was. He could be a mess attendant, a servant. He would cook the meals, wash the dishes, shine the shoes, and do the laundry for the white officers and crew. He would not be trained to fire the ship's guns. He would not be taught to navigate or to fight. The leaders of the time genuinely believed that such things were beyond the ability of a black man, and that no white sailor would ever accept serving alongside one as an equal. So Doris Miller put on the uniform and took up the only role they would give him. He was assigned eventually to a great battleship, the West Virginia, stationed at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. He carried trays and scrubbed pots, and in his spare time, this powerfully built young man became the heavyweight boxing champion of the entire ship. The crew knew he was the strongest man aboard. The Navy still saw only a cook. Think about what that does to a person. To be told every single day by the most powerful Navy on earth that the limit of what you are allowed to be is a servant, that your strength, your courage, your intelligence, none of it counts because of the color of your skin. Doris Miller lived inside that message for 2 years. And then, on one terrible morning, the world gave him a chance to answer it. The 7th of December, 1941 began like any other Sunday. Miller had risen early, around 6 in the morning, and was moving through the lower decks of the West Virginia collecting laundry. Just before 8, the alarm for battle stations tore through the ship. Out in the harbor, the sky had filled with Japanese aircraft. The attack on Pearl Harbor had begun. Miller ran to the position the Navy had assigned him for combat, a magazine deep inside the ship where ammunition was stored. But when he got there, he found it already destroyed. A torpedo had torn into the West Virginia, and the compartment was wrecked. With his assigned station gone, Miller did not hide, and he did not wait. He went up, toward the noise and the fire, onto the open deck, into the middle of the worst attack the American Navy had ever suffered. Remember, this was a man the Navy had never trained to fight. He had never been taught to fire a gun, never prepared for a moment like this, and he was walking straight into it. The scene topside was beyond anything these men had ever imagined. The Japanese had launched hundreds of aircraft against Pearl Harbor that morning, wave after wave of bombers and fighters, and they had caught the American fleet at anchor, unprepared. All around the West Virginia, the great battleships of the Pacific Fleet were being torn apart. Nearby, the Arizona took a hit to her magazine and erupted in a fireball that killed more than 1,000 men at once. Burning oil from the stricken ships spread across the surface of the harbor and onto the decks, so that the water itself was on fire. The West Virginia had been hit by torpedoes along her side and was beginning to roll and sink. Torpedoes were still slamming home. Bombs were falling. Smoke blotted out the morning sun. In the middle of all of it stood a cook who, by every rule of the Navy, had no business being anywhere near the fighting. Because Doris Miller was the strongest man on the ship, the officers put that strength to use. He was set to carrying the wounded, lifting broken and bleeding men onto his shoulders, and hauling them out of the rising water and the spreading flames toward whatever safety could still be found. He waded through water that was waist-deep in places, across decks slick with oil, men's lives literally on his back. He went back, again and again, through the smoke and the fire, carrying men who could not carry themselves. Then, an officer called him to the bridge, the command center of the ship. The captain of the West Virginia, a man named Mervyn Bennion, had been struck in the stomach by shrapnel and was dying. Even gravely wounded, the captain had refused to leave his post and kept trying to command his ship. Miller, along with others, worked to move the mortally wounded captain to a place of greater shelter. There was nothing anyone could do to save him. But even in the chaos, they would not leave their captain lying exposed on the open bridge. And it is here that Doris Miller did the thing the Navy had spent 2 years telling him he could never do. There was a gun on that deck, an anti-aircraft gun, unattended, its crew dead or gone. By every rule of that segregated Navy, Doris Miller was forbidden from touching it. He had never been trained to fire it. He was a cook. So what did the cook do? He picked it up. Doris Miller stepped to one of the ship's anti-aircraft machine guns, a heavy .50 caliber weapon, and he began to fire it at the Japanese planes diving on the harbor. A man who had never been allowed near a gun in his life was now standing in the open on a burning and sinking battleship, firing round after round into the sky. Later, when people asked him how he had managed it, Miller answered with a kind of plain modesty that said everything about him. He told them it had not been hard. He had simply pulled the trigger, he said, and the gun worked fine. He had watched the others handle those weapons, and he had learned by watching. He guessed he had fired it for about 15 minutes, and he believed he had hit at least one of the planes coming down at the ship. The official Navy records would credit him with one enemy aircraft. Miller and other men who were there that day believed it was more, perhaps several. The exact number has been argued over ever since. But the number was never really the point. The point was that a man the Navy refused to train had grabbed a weapon under the deadliest fire imaginable and fought back until his ammunition was gone and the order finally came to abandon the sinking ship. For 15 minutes, Doris Miller had done the impossible. You would think his country would want the whole world to know his name. Instead, it did the exact opposite. The West Virginia settled to the bottom of the harbor. Of the more than 1,500 men aboard her that morning, 130 were killed and dozens more were wounded. Across Pearl Harbor, the toll was catastrophic. More than 2,400 Americans died that day, and the United States was plunged into the Second World War. In the days and weeks that followed, an astonishing story began to circulate. Word spread of a black messman who had manned a machine gun at Pearl Harbor with no training at all and fought like a veteran. But there was a problem. The Navy would not say who he was. White sailors who had performed heroically were named and celebrated quickly. Their photographs in the newspapers, their families told of their bravery. The black sailor who had stood at that gun was referred to, for months, only as an unnamed Negro messman. The men in charge seemed in no hurry at all to put a name and a face to him. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. A man had done something extraordinary, something that contradicted everything the Navy claimed about black sailors, and the response of the institution was not to celebrate it, but to keep him anonymous, to let the deed exist without the man, as if naming him would force them to admit something they were not ready to admit. It was the black press that refused to let him disappear. A newspaper called the Pittsburgh Courier, working with a researcher from a Center for Black History and Culture in Harlem, pressed the Navy and dug for the truth. In the spring of 1942, they finally announced his name to the country. The unidentified hero of Pearl Harbor was Doris Miller, a cook from Waco, Texas. The campaign to recognize him had begun, and it came not from the top, but from his own community demanding that he be seen. It gave him less. Now the Navy faced a choice. A black cook had become one of the most famous heroes of Pearl Harbor. The whole country was learning his name. Many people, including members of Congress, began to call for Doris Miller to receive the Medal of Honor, the highest award the nation can give. So what did the Navy do with the man whose courage had embarrassed every assumption it held? The push for the Medal of Honor stalled and ultimately failed. Instead, Miller was awarded the Navy Cross. It was still a tremendous honor, the first time it had ever been given to a black sailor, and on the deck of a carrier in Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz himself pinned it to Miller's chest in front of the assembled crew. It was a genuine milestone, but it was also, to many who watched, a careful and deliberate decision to recognize him just enough without going all the way. And there is one more detail that says it plainly. After everything Doris Miller had done, after the wounded he carried, the captain he moved, and the gun he fired, the Navy's reward in terms of his actual rank was to promote him from mess, attendant to cook, third class. He had changed history on that deck. He was still, in the eyes of the Navy, a man who belonged in the kitchen. The Navy did understand the power of his story, and it used it. Miller was sent back to the United States on a war bond tour, the first African American allowed to travel and speak as part of one. His face appeared on a recruiting poster beneath the words, "Above and Beyond the Call of Duty." For a country that needed heroes and needed every man it could enlist, Doris Miller had become a symbol. He carried that role quietly, hoping, as he wrote in one of his few letters, that he had opened a door at least a little wider for the black sailors who would come after him. Then he went back to the war. He did not have to. He could have ridden his fame and stayed safe at home. Instead, in 1943, Doris Miller returned to the Pacific, assigned to a small aircraft carrier called the Liscum Bay. Doris Miller had already given his country more than it ever gave him. He could have stayed home a hero, but he chose to go back. And this time, he would not come home at all. On the 24th of November, 1943, the Liscum Bay was steaming near the Gilbert Islands in the Pacific, supporting the American invasion of those islands, when a torpedo from a Japanese submarine struck her in the dark hours before dawn. The blast set off the ship's store of aircraft bombs, and the resulting explosion was enormous, tearing the small carrier open. She sank in roughly 20 minutes. There was almost no time to escape. Of the roughly 900 men aboard, more than 600 were killed. Doris Miller was among them. He was 24 years old. His body was never recovered. His parents back in Waco received a telegram telling them their son was missing in action, and by a cruel coincidence, that news reached them on the second anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the very battle that had made his name known to the world. A year later, he was officially declared dead. The hero the Navy had been so slow to name was gone, lost in the same ocean he had crossed to serve a country that had never treated him as an equal. He never lived to see how that country would eventually come to remember him. Because the story of Doris Miller did not end when that carrier went down. In the decades that followed, the recognition that his own Navy had been so reluctant to give in his lifetime only kept growing, until his name became one of the most honored in the entire service. In 1973, the Navy named a warship after him. His face was placed on a postage stamp. Schools, parks, and community centers across the country took his name. And then, decades after a segregated Navy had decided that a black man could only ever be a servant, that same Navy made a decision that would have been unthinkable on the morning he died. It announced that one of its largest and most powerful aircraft carriers, a vessel that will sail for half a century, would be named the Doris Miller. It is the first carrier in the history of the United States Navy to be named for an enlisted sailor, and the first ever named for a black American. When it joins the fleet, his name will be carried across the world's oceans for generations. And yet to this day, the medal that so many believed he earned, the Medal of Honor, has never been awarded to him. The debate over that has never fully gone away. Doris Miller was a cook because his country told him that was all he was allowed to be. And then, on the worst morning in the history of the American Navy, he carried the wounded, he moved his dying captain, and he stood on a sinking deck and fired a weapon he had never been trained to touch, because in that moment none of their rules mattered, only courage did. He spent his whole short life being underestimated, and he answered it not with anger, but with action so undeniable that history was forced to catch up to him. He did not live to see the warship that bears his name, but every sailor who ever serves aboard it will know exactly who he was, and what a cook from Waco did when the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. If you believe these men deserve to be remembered, subscribe and stay with this channel. There are more of these stories than you could ever imagine, and almost no one is telling them.